How can a small nation, trapped between the giants of Brazil and Argentina, rise to become the world's very first modern welfare state? Uruguay, a land with barely 3 million people, no mountains of gold, no endless oil fields. Yet it shaped a story that astonished the world. A history marked by bloodshed and resilience, by battles for survival and bold experiments in justice, education, and human rights. If you've ever believed that small nations cannot leave a great mark, the journey of Uruguay will make you think again. Long before ships with foreign flags pierced the horizon, the land we now call Uruguay belonged to the Charrua. They were not builders of towering pyramids or keepers of golden temples. They left behind no cities carved in stone. Instead, they lived with the earth in motion, moving with the rhythm of the seasons. The Charrua were a semi-nomadic people. Hunters, fishers, gatherers. Their lives flowed along rivers, across plains, and into coastal lagoons. They traveled light, carrying only what the land allowed, leaving little behind but footprints in the sand and smoke rising from small fires. To outsiders, this might look like emptiness. But to the Charrua, it was a life of balance. They believed the land was not something to be owned, but something to be shared. A river was not a border. A plain was not a possession. Every stream, every grove of trees carried stories passed from elders to children. Survival was not measured by conquest, but by harmony with the world around them. The Spanish would later call this land La Banda Oriental, the eastern bank of the River Plate. But for the Charrua, it was simply home. A place where they tracked deer through tall grasses, where they fished with bone hooks in shimmering waters, where they gathered roots and berries as they followed the season's cycles. Their existence was modest, but it carried a dignity rooted in resilience. If you close your eyes, you can almost see it. A sunrise spreading light across endless pampas. A Charrua family breaking camp, tying hides and woven baskets onto their shoulders. Children running barefoot through dew-soaked grass. Hunters sharpening spears with stones, ready to follow the trail of game. Women collecting wild herbs to heal the sick. All of it unfolding in silence, broken only by the wind that swept across the open plains. The Charrua were also fierce when threatened. Their reputation as warriors was etched into the memories of neighboring tribes. They mastered the use of boleadoras, stone weights tied to cords that could be thrown to entangle the legs of prey or enemies alike. With speed, precision, and a deep knowledge of the land, they defended their home from intruders long before Europeans ever set foot there. But history is cruel to those who leave little behind. Unlike the Inca, Maya, or Aztec, the Charrua did not build empires that could resist invasion for decades. Their nomadic way of life meant they could vanish into the landscape. But it also left them vulnerable to the sweeping ambitions of European conquest. What they considered freedom, movement, simplicity, connection with nature, would later be seen by colonizers as weakness. This contrast holds a haunting symbolism. Imagine a land like a mirror of water, smooth, unbroken, reflecting the sky. That was Uruguay before colonization. The Charrua walked upon its surface, careful not to shatter it. But across the ocean, empires prepared to cast their stones. And when they did, the mirror cracked. The arrival of Europeans in the 16th century was not immediate devastation. At first, explorers passed by, searching for gold and silver, dismissing this land as poor, unimportant, empty of riches. That very neglect gave the Charrua a fragile reprieve. While Spanish conquistadors bled Mexico and Peru for treasure, Uruguay remained, for a brief moment, on the margins. Yet the shadow was already lengthening. Diseases carried on the breath and bodies of foreigners began to spread, even before permanent settlements were established. Smallpox, measles, influenza, silent killers that moved faster than muskets. Entire bands of Charrúa were wiped out without a single battle being fought. Death crept into their camps in the form of fevered children and wasted elders, leaving behind silence where songs once echoed. Still, they endured. The Charrúa adapted, as they always had. They watched strangers sail past their shores. They avoided direct confrontation when possible, melting back into forests and marshes. They continued to hunt, to fish, to wander. But they could feel the storm building beyond the horizon. European expansion was inevitable. As Portugal and Spain drew invisible lines across the globe through the Treaty of Tordesillas, this land, unknown to the Charrúa, was already claimed. They had no say, no awareness that their homeland had been signed away by kings an ocean away. When settlers finally arrived, they would bring not just new tools and weapons, but an entirely different concept of land, ownership, borders, control. For the Charrúa, this was unthinkable. How can you own the wind? How can you fence the river? How can you put boundaries on a plain that stretches as far as the eye can see? To them, it was as absurd as trying to own the sky. But for Europeans, it was law, empire, destiny. Two visions of the world were on a collision course. And so, Uruguay's earliest story is one of fragile beauty on the edge of disappearance. A people living in balance with the land, unaware that their way of life would soon be targeted, dismantled, erased. The Charrúa left behind no monuments of stone, but they remain as ghosts in the soil, whispers in the wind, shadows in the national memory. Even today, Uruguayans look back and see in the Charrúa a tragic symbol. The first guardians of the land, silenced before their voices could be fully heard. Their fate foreshadows the struggles that would define Uruguay itself. Caught between forces larger than itself, forced to fight for survival, and yet leaving behind a legacy far greater than their size. The story of Uruguay cannot begin without them. Before there were cities, before there were flags, before there was even the idea of a nation, there was the Charrúa, children of the plains, hunters of the rivers, keepers of a freedom so fragile it could not withstand the storm about to come. When the Spanish and Portuguese empires carved the New World, Uruguay was not their prized jewel. It had no silver mountains like Potosi, no golden temples like Cusco, no empires to topple, no vast cities to plunder. To the conquistadors, this land was poor, flat, and seemingly empty, and so, for a time, it was ignored. But neglect can be dangerous. In the shadows of indifference, Uruguay became something else, a battlefield. By the early 1600s, both Spain and Portugal looked again at this forgotten corner of South America. Its value was not in treasure buried beneath the soil, but in geography. The Rio de la Plata, the great river mouth where fresh water met the Atlantic, was a gateway. Whoever controlled it, controlled trade, movement, and access to the heart of the continent. The Spanish established Buenos Aires on one bank. The Portuguese pushed down from Brazil on the other. Between them lay the eastern shore, today's Uruguay. Neither empire could afford to let the other take it unchallenged. Montevideo was born not as a city of dreams, but as a fortress. In 1724, Spain ordered its construction, desperate to secure the estuary against Portuguese encroachment. Soldiers, not settlers, were its first inhabitants. Cannons pointed outward toward the sea. Thick walls of stone guarded its edges. From the very beginning, Montevideo's heartbeat was military. Imagine the scene. Portuguese ships anchoring off the coast, their flags flapping in the wind. Spanish soldiers dragging stones to build bastions, sweat mixing with dust. The cries of the few surviving Charrua, scattered and hunted, echoing in the background like ghosts. A city built on tension, waiting for attack. The Charrua, already decimated by disease and raids, faced a new horror: extermination. They resisted fiercely, ambushing patrols, striking at settlements, but their numbers dwindled. In 1831, decades later, they would suffer their final massacre at Salsipuedes. But even in the colonial period, their fate was clear. Uruguay's original guardians were being erased to make way for empires that saw the land not as sacred, but as strategic. Uruguay became a pawn in the larger imperial chessboard. When Spain and Portugal clashed, it was here their soldiers marched. When treaties were signed in Europe, the borders of Uruguay shifted like sand, often without a single voice from the people who lived there. For centuries, its destiny was decided in distant palaces, in Madrid, in Lisbon, later even in London. And yet, this very marginality gave Uruguay a peculiar resilience. Unlike Peru or Mexico, it was not drained of gold or enslaved in massive mines. Unlike Brazil, it was not reshaped into vast plantations from the start. Instead, it existed in the margins, its population sparse, its economy modest, its struggles quiet. It was, in many ways, a land surviving in the spaces between giants. Still, the scars deepened. By the 18th century, cattle introduced by Europeans roamed the plains in the millions. What was once wild grassland became pasture. The gaucho, half settler, half nomad, emerged as a new symbol of the land. Knife in belt, horse beneath him, he was heir to both the Charrua's mobility and Europe's intrusion. The gaucho lived free, but also rootless, drifting across a territory claimed by others. To the Spanish crown, Uruguay was La Banda Oriental, the eastern shore of the River Plate. To the Portuguese, it was a dangerous gap between their colony of Brazil and the Atlantic trade routes. To the British, watching from afar, it was a future pawn in global commerce. To the Charrua, what remained of them, it was still home. Colonial Uruguay was, in truth, less a colony and more a crossroads. Soldiers garrisoned Montevideo. Merchants trafficked cattle hides and salted meat. Smugglers thrived, slipping goods past customs houses, feeding a black market that stretched from Europe to Africa. In every alley of Montevideo, whispers of contraband were as common as church bells. Life was harsh. Disease swept through cramped quarters. Food was simple, often scarce. Families of immigrants struggled to take root in a land still soaked with conflict. And always, the threat of invasion loomed. From the north, Portuguese forces. From across the estuary, Argentine militias. From beyond the seas, European fleets. Uruguay, in those centuries, had no chance to shape its own destiny. It was shaped by others, by treaties, by battles, by imperial neglect and imperial greed. It was a frontier, never a center. A land constantly fought over, never fully claimed. And yet, in that crucible of uncertainty, a seed was planted. The experience of being ignored, occupied, and pulled between powers would forge in Uruguayans a sharp sense of survival. They learned that to exist between giants, one must be stubborn, cunning, resilient. History remembers Uruguay as the forgotten battlefield. But from those forgotten plains, from those battered fortresses, from the blood of the Charrúa and the sweat of gauchos, a nation would eventually rise. A nation not built on gold, but on grit. Not born of abundance, but of struggle. The empires came and went. The cannons of Montevideo grew rusty. The treaties faded into dust. But Uruguay remained, scarred and small, yet alive. And this survival, this persistence between two giants, set the stage for the next chapter, the fight for independence. The struggle for independence in Uruguay did not begin with fireworks or declarations. It began with whispers, with small uprisings, with scattered bands of men who had little more than horses, knives, and the stubborn will to resist. At the center of this storm stood one man, José Gervasio Artigas. Today, he is remembered as the father of the nation. But in 1811, he was simply a frontier officer who chose rebellion over obedience. Artigas saw what others ignored. He saw the suffocating grip of Spanish rule. He saw the hunger of Portuguese expansion from Brazil. And he understood the danger of Argentina's ambitions, waiting just across the Rio de la Plata. For Uruguay, there would be no simple path to freedom. The enemy was not one empire, but many. In May 1811, Artigas launched his uprising against Spanish authorities. His army was not polished. It was a force of gauchos, farmers, runaway slaves, and indigenous allies. Men hardened by the land, men who had nothing to lose. They carried rifles when they could, machetes when they could not. Their discipline was loose, but their passion fierce. The first great clash came at Las Piedras. Artigas led a ragtag force of about 1,000 against the Spanish garrison. The odds were impossible. But he fought with the fury of someone who believed survival itself was at stake. Against expectation, the Patriots won. The Spanish retreated. A flame had been lit. But victory was never permanent. Soon after, Montevideo remained under royalist control. The city's cannons, supplied by Spain, made it an impregnable fortress. Artigas and his followers camped outside the city in what became known as the Oriental Exodus. Thousands of families abandoned their homes, following him across the plains, seeking safety under his leadership. It was less an army and more a wandering nation. Picture the scene. Caravans of ox carts creaking under the weight of children and old men. Women leading horses. Gauchos riding ahead as scouts, their ponchos flapping in the wind. Artigas at the center, not a king on a throne, but a leader in the saddle. The sky stretched endlessly above them. The land offered no shelter, yet still they moved forward. For the Spanish crown, these rebels were dangerous but manageable. What truly worried them was the larger struggle in the region. Across the river, Buenos Aires had already declared independence. Argentina wanted to unite the lands of the Rio de la Plata into one federation. But Artigas distrusted them. He feared that trading one master for another would not bring freedom. This mistrust cut deep. Uruguayans found themselves caught in a triangle of power. Spain clinging to Montevideo, Argentina seeking control, Portugal eyeing expansion from Brazil. To exist, they had to fight all three. Artigas proposed something radical. He envisioned a federation of provinces, bound not by domination, but by equality. He spoke of land reform, giving plots to the poor, the freed slaves, and the indigenous who had long been ignored. In his vision, Uruguay would not be a pawn, but a partner. The elites in Buenos Aires hated this idea. His federalism threatened their central authority. His redistribution threatened their wealth. Soon, Argentina turned against him. Allies became rivals. Brothers became enemies. By the 1820s, Portuguese forces from Brazil marched in, seizing Montevideo. For a brief and bitter period, Uruguay was absorbed into the Brazilian Empire as the Cisplatin province. Artigas, betrayed and isolated, was forced into exile in Paraguay, where he would die decades later, far from the land he fought to free. And yet, even in defeat, his dream lingered. The people had tasted self-rule. They had felt the possibility of independence. They would not forget. The final act came not from battlefield glory, but from diplomacy. In 1828, after years of bloodshed, Britain stepped in as mediator, not out of kindness, but out of interest. Britain wanted balance in the Rio de la Plata. A small independent Uruguay would serve as a buffer between Argentina and Brazil, preventing either giant from dominating the river's trade. And so, by treaty, Uruguay was declared independent. Its sovereignty was not born of pure victory, nor of a single hero's triumph. It was born from survival between giants, carved out by necessity and sealed by foreign diplomacy. Independence was fragile. The wounds of exile, betrayal, and endless war ran deep. Artigas never returned to see his people free. But his shadow remained. His ideals of federalism, equality, and resistance would shape Uruguay's soul long after his body lay in foreign soil. The story of independence, then, is not one of triumph alone. It is one of endurance. Uruguay did not emerge as a nation because it conquered its enemies outright. It emerged because it refused to vanish. A country born not from conquest, but from persistence. Not from victory, but from survival. Independence did not bring peace. It brought division. Uruguay, in the 19th century, was a nation constantly at war with itself. Two flags, two visions, two factions locked in endless struggle. On one side stood the Colorados. They were liberals, urban, linked to Montevideo and its growing ties to Europe. They believed in free trade, modernization, and foreign connections. Red was their banner, and progress was their cry. On the other side stood the Blancos. They were conservatives, rooted in the countryside, aligned with ranchers and provincial landowners. They defended tradition, autonomy, and the rural way of life. White was their color, and stability their shield. Colorado versus Blanco, red versus white. For decades, these two forces tore the nation apart. Civil wars erupted again and again, sometimes brief, sometimes stretching for years. Alliances shifted like sand. Victories turned to defeats overnight. Cities changed hands. Countryside villages burned. Uruguay became less a country than a battlefield where brothers fought brothers under different banners. Foreign powers only deepened the wound. Argentina, itself racked by internal strife, often intervened, backing one side or the other. Brazil too saw Uruguay as a chess piece, useful to weaken Argentina or to secure its own borders. Both giants played their games with Uruguayan lives, turning local conflicts into regional struggles. Montevideo became a prize to be fought over. The city, with its port and strategic location, was the key to power. Whoever held Montevideo held the heart of Uruguay. And so, siege followed siege, blockade followed blockade. The people of the city lived in cycles of hunger, fear, and fleeting relief. One of the darkest episodes came during the Guerra Grande, the Great War, 1839 to 1851. For 12 long years, Uruguay was plunged into chaos. The Blancos, backed by Argentina's dictator Juan Manuel de Rosas, held Montevideo's countryside. The Colorados, supported by European mercenaries and later Brazil, clung to Montevideo itself. Inside Montevideo, life was surreal. The city was under siege, but it became a cosmopolitan hub. Italians, French, and even exiled Argentines flocked to its streets. Soldiers of fortune signed up to fight. Newspapers flourished, theaters performed, intellectuals debated. It was called the New Troy by some, an embattled city holding out against overwhelming odds. Outside the walls, the countryside bled. Farms burned. Families fled. Soldiers roamed the plains, seizing cattle, enforcing loyalty by force. The war was less about ideology than about survival. Ordinary people were caught between flags, punished by both. The Great War ended only with heavy foreign involvement. Brazil invaded. Argentina's Rosas fell from power. In the aftermath, the Colorados triumphed, but the divisions never healed. Civil strife remained the rhythm of Uruguayan politics. Through the mid and late 19th century, presidents rose and fell like tides. Some assassinated, others overthrown. Coups were common. Constitutions were rewritten. Stability seemed impossible. The very idea of Uruguay as a unified nation often felt fragile, as if one more war might tear it apart completely. Yet, out of this turbulence, new identities were forged. The gaucho, once a wanderer of the plains, became a national symbol, brave, independent, free. His image appeared in poems, songs, and political rhetoric. Both Colorados and Blancos claimed him as their own, even as they sent him to die on battlefields. The economy, too, was reshaped by conflict. Cattle remained the lifeblood of Uruguay, but wars devastated herds and disrupted trade. British merchants, seeking to protect their interests, pushed for modernization. Railroads began to creep across the land. Telegraph lines connected towns. Slowly, painfully, Uruguay began to knit itself together, even as politics kept tearing it apart. By the late 1800s, the endless wars had left scars. Generations grew up knowing nothing but division. Red or white, city or countryside, progress or tradition. These dichotomies haunted every election, every alliance, every rebellion. But within the chaos lay a paradox. Conflict prevented domination by any single group. Neither the Colorados nor the Blancos could eliminate the other. And so, Uruguay survived, not because it found peace, but because it endured balance through struggle. Foreign influence remained constant. Britain, Brazil, Argentina, all interfered when it suited them. Uruguay was small, vulnerable, yet too strategically important to be ignored. Its sovereignty was always conditional, always fragile, always negotiated in the shadow of larger powers. Still, the nation endured. Through bloodshed, sieges, betrayals, and exiles, Uruguayans learned resilience. They carried forward the memory of Artigas, exiled and betrayed, yet still a symbol of independence. They looked at their divided flags and dreamed of something greater, something beyond endless war. As the century closed, a new generation began to rise. They were tired of division. They wanted stability. They wanted reform. They wanted a Uruguay that was not simply a pawn in the games of neighbors or the battleground of factions. The stage was being set for a transformation. For out of civil war and foreign meddling, a new Uruguay would emerge. Modern, reformist, daring. But before that dawn, the country had to endure one last century of blood under the shadow of two flags. A century where survival was victory. A century where unity remained only a dream. Montevideo was not born as a city of poets. It was not raised from the ground to be a beacon of art or culture. It began as a fortress, a line of stone built to hold off invasion, to watch the horizon, to keep enemies at bay. And yet, over time, that fortress grew into something more. By the mid-19th century, Montevideo had become the beating heart of Uruguay. Its port, carved against the waves of the Rio de la Plata, was the key. Ships arrived daily, steamers from Europe, schooners from Brazil, clippers from Argentina. Goods flowed in and out, cattle hides, salted beef, wool. In return came machinery, textiles, books, and ideas. Montevideo was a crossroads, a meeting point of worlds. Immigrants arrived in waves, Italians fleeing poverty, Spaniards seeking work, Jews escaping persecution. They crowded into the city's streets, each carrying languages, songs, and traditions. Within a single block, one could hear Italian opera, Spanish guitar, and Yiddish prayers. The air was thick with voices, markets, arguments, laughter. The city expanded. Streets were paved. Lamps lit the night. Cafes opened where men debated politics until dawn. Newspapers multiplied, printing fiery editorials and revolutionary ideas. Montevideo became more than a port. It became a laboratory of culture. It was here that tango began to take shape. Born of the underworld, forged in the dance halls of immigrants and the passion of the poor, it blended African rhythms, European melodies, and local longing. At first, the elites dismissed it as vulgar, but slowly the sound spread, carrying the pulse of the city to the world. Alongside tango rose another rhythm, candombe. Rooted in the traditions of Afro-Uruguayans, it was drummed in courtyards, danced in the streets during carnival, remembered from the time of slavery. The beat was hypnotic, the movement fierce. Together, tango and candombe gave Montevideo its own soundtrack, a fusion of struggle and joy, pain and defiance. Football, too, arrived on Montevideo's shores. Introduced by British immigrants, it spread quickly through schools and neighborhoods. Boys kicked balls made of rags on dusty lots. Clubs were founded, rivalries born. What began as a foreign pastime soon became a national passion. In time, football would turn into one of Uruguay's most powerful symbols. But its roots were here, in Montevideo's streets and fields. Life in the city was not easy. Crowded tenements held entire families in single rooms. Work in the port was grueling, with long hours and little pay. Disease spread quickly in damp, narrow alleys. Yet for many, Montevideo represented hope. It was a place to start over, to find opportunity, to build a new life far from the wars that had scarred the countryside. The city stood in contrast to rural Uruguay. The countryside was slow, tied to ranching and tradition, dominated by the rivalries of Colorados and Blancos. Montevideo was fast, modernizing, outward-looking. It leaned toward the Colorados, whose liberal politics aligned with trade and immigration. The Blancos, representing the landowners, distrusted the city's cosmopolitan spirit. Thus, the divide between city and country grew deeper, shaping the politics of the nation for generations. Montevideo also became a stage for foreign influence. British merchants established banks and businesses. French intellectuals passed through, spreading revolutionary ideas. The city was a hinge, connecting Uruguay not only to its neighbors, but to the Atlantic world. And yet, beneath its bustle, Montevideo carried scars. The memory of sieges, of hunger, of cannons on its walls. The awareness that its prosperity was fragile, always at risk from war, from blockades, from the ambitions of larger powers. The city lived with one eye on the sea and the other on the plains, caught between opportunity and threat. Still, it grew. By the late 19th century, Montevideo was known as the Athens of the Rio de la Plata, not for its temples, but for its culture. Writers, poets, musicians, and thinkers gathered in its cafes. The city was alive with ideas, and with them came the possibility of reinvention. Montevideo's rise was not just about trade or culture. It was about identity. In its crowded streets, Uruguayans began to see themselves not merely as pawns of Brazil or Argentina, not merely as rural gauchos or urban merchants, but as something distinct. A people of mixed roots, forged in conflict, yet capable of creating something uniquely their own. The port, the immigrants, the music, the football, all of it blended into a shared story, a small nation, but one with a city that pulsed like a capital of the world. The fortress of Montevideo had become a metropolis, and within its walls, the seeds of a new Uruguay were being planted. A Uruguay that would one day surprise the globe with its boldness, its reforms, its vision. But before that, the city and the nation would need a leader. Someone who could harness its energy, its divisions, its dreams. Someone who would transform Uruguay from a fragile republic into a model of modern welfare. That leader was José Batlle y Ordóñez. At the turn of the 20th century, Uruguay stood at a crossroads. The wars of the 19th century had left scars. Political divisions, rural poverty, fragile institutions. Yet Montevideo was rising, brimming with immigrants, culture, and ideas. The country was ready for change, but it needed a visionary. That visionary was José Batlle y Ordóñez. Batlle was not the first to dream of reform, but he was the first to carry it out with determination. Twice president of Uruguay, in 1903 to 1907, and again from 1911-1915, he reshaped the nation in ways few leaders ever have. His vision was radical for its time, almost unthinkable in Latin America, and yet he pursued it relentlessly. He looked at Uruguay and saw possibility. A small country, yes. Trapped between giants, yes. But also a nation that could experiment, that could lead, that could show the world that size did not define greatness. Battle's reforms cut deep into the old order. He began with the state itself. He believed government should not be the tool of elites, but the guardian of all citizens. He pushed for secularism, separating church from state. Religion would no longer dictate law. Schools would be public, free, and open to all. Education became the backbone of his project. A literate population, he argued, was a free population. He then turned to social justice. In a region where laborers were often treated as disposable, Batlle introduced protections that were revolutionary. An 8-hour workday, paid holidays, unemployment benefits, retirement pensions, health insurance. He built what would become the world's first welfare state, not in Europe, not in the United States, but in tiny Uruguay. For the poor, it was salvation. For workers, it was dignity. For the elites, it was a shock. Opponents accused Batlle of socialism. They mocked him as a dreamer. They warned that Uruguay would collapse under the weight of such generosity. But Batlle pressed on. He believed that prosperity was meaningless if it did not reach every citizen. He saw the state not as a burden, but as an engine of fairness. Industry was nationalized. Banks, utilities, and monopolies were placed under state control to prevent exploitation. Newspapers flourished, voicing debates, spreading new ideas. Uruguay became known as a laboratory of democracy and reform. Imagine the contrast. While much of Latin America was still under oligarchic rule, where workers had no voice and peasants no rights, Uruguay was experimenting with welfare, secularism, and social democracy. Montevideo became a magnet for thinkers, reformers, and activists across the continent. People looked at Uruguay and saw something extraordinary. A small republic daring to act like a great one. Batlle also believed in pluralism. He tried to reduce the dominance of the presidency by proposing a collegial executive, a council that would share power. Though controversial, it reflected his deep commitment to avoiding dictatorship. He wanted Uruguay to be governed not by one man's will, but by collective deliberation. The results were dramatic. By the 1920s, Uruguay had the highest literacy rates in Latin America. Workers enjoyed protections unheard of elsewhere. Women gained the right to vote earlier than in most countries. Civil rights expanded. Montevideo shone as one of the most modern capitals in the hemisphere. Foreign observers called Uruguay the Switzerland of South America. Not because of mountains or neutrality, but because of its stability, prosperity, and advanced social systems. A nation of barely 3 million had achieved what empires had not. But Battle's revolution was not only political, it was cultural. Uruguayans began to see themselves differently. No longer merely survivors between Brazil and Argentina, they were citizens of a progressive republic. They believed their country, though small, could set an example for the world. Of course, shadows remained. The rural countryside often lagged behind the capital's prosperity. Some landowners resisted reforms. Political divisions between Colorados and Blancos did not disappear overnight. Yet the trajectory was clear. Uruguay was moving towards something new, something bold. Batlle died in 1929, just before the Great Depression would test the foundations he had built. But his legacy endured. Streets were named after him, statues erected. Children learned his name in schools, and more importantly, the institutions he created survived. His reforms were not perfect. They were not complete. But they gave Uruguay a foundation unlike any other in the region. A foundation that would carry it through crises, dictatorships, and recoveries. A foundation that made it the world's first modern welfare nation. José Batlle y Ordóñez transformed Uruguay. He took a small, fragile republic and made it a pioneer. He proved that vision could be greater than size, that justice could be stronger than wealth, that progress could be written into the very structure of a state. And for that, he remains more than a leader. He remains the architect of modern Uruguay. The 1920s had ended in triumph. Uruguay stood proud, a model of democracy, a pioneer of social reform. The world looked at Montevideo and called it the Switzerland of South America. But history is cruel. The crash came in 1929. The Great Depression, born in New York, rippled outward like a tidal wave. Nations fell into chaos. Economies crumbled. Uruguay, small and dependent on exports, could not escape. For decades, the country had thrived on beef and wool. Ships carried its meat to Europe, its wool-clothed factories in Britain. Demand was steady, prices were high. Then suddenly, the markets collapsed. Ships still left Montevideo's harbor, but their holds were half empty. Buyers in Europe had no money. Warehouses filled with unsold goods, prices plummeted. What had been prosperity turned overnight into despair. Uruguay's welfare model, revolutionary though it was, now faced its greatest test. Social programs continued, but the funds to support them shrank. The state had promised pensions, health care, education. Now it struggled to keep the promises alive. For ordinary families, the pain was real. Workers were laid off. Farmers lost their herds. Shops closed. Immigrants who had come in search of hope faced hunger instead. Lines for bread grew longer. Men searched the docks for jobs that no longer existed. Women stretched meals with beans and bread, hiding their fear from their children. The dream of Batlle Ordóñez did not die, but it weakened. The government tried to adapt. Some reforms were scaled back. Others were preserved at all costs, as symbols of what Uruguay stood for. Even in poverty, education remained free. Even in crisis, pensions were not abandoned. But the balance was fragile. Politically, instability deepened. The two old parties, Colorados and Blancos, still fought for control. But the real enemy was economic collapse. Presidents came and went. Policies shifted from austerity to stimulus, from free trade to protectionism. Nothing seemed to work. In the countryside, resentment grew. Ranchers saw profits vanish. Gauchos abandoned the land, moving to cities in search of work. Rural poverty, long ignored, became impossible to hide. The divide between city and countryside widened. Montevideo still pulsed with culture, cafes, and football matches. But outside the capital, despair reigned. The crisis also revealed Uruguay's vulnerability. For all its progress, the nation remained dependent on foreign markets, on global demand, on ships that carried its goods across the sea. It had no empire to shield it, no vast resources to fall back on, only cattle, wool, and the fragile promise of reform. And yet, there was resilience. Uruguay did not collapse into dictatorship, as so many of its neighbors did. It bent, but it did not break. The institutions Batlle had built, education, civil rights, welfare, gave the country a spine. Still, the mood darkened. Intellectuals debated the future. Could Uruguay continue to sustain such ambitious social programs with so little wealth? Could it remain democratic when poverty gnawed at its stability? The Depression stretched through the 1930s. Families adapted. They planted gardens in small plots. They bartered goods. They relied on extended kin. Uruguayans learned to endure, as their ancestors had endured sieges and wars. By the late 1930s, the world shifted again. A new storm gathered in Europe. The Second World War would change global trade, reopen markets, and ironically, bring relief to Uruguay. Demand for meat and wool surged once more. Ships left Montevideo full, their cargoes bound for armies and factories overseas. But the lesson of the Depression lingered. Uruguay had learned that prosperity was fragile, that even the most advanced welfare state could be shaken by forces far beyond its control. The shadows of the 1930s hung over the nation. People remembered the hunger, the uncertainty, the broken promises. They remembered that greatness, no matter how bright, could dim overnight. The welfare dream survived, scarred but alive. Uruguay emerged battered, but still standing. It had faced its first great crisis not from within, but from the world beyond. And though it survived, the cracks were visible. Cracks that would widen in decades to come, until once again, the nation found itself struggling to hold its identity together. For now, Uruguay returned to prosperity. But in its memory, the ghost of the Depression whispered a warning. Progress is fragile, and history never sleeps. The dream of Uruguay as a model democracy was shaken again in the 1970s. The land once praised as the Switzerland of South America descended into one of its darkest winters. It began with crisis. The economy faltered. Inflation soared. Jobs vanished. Strikes and protests filled the streets of Montevideo. Ordinary people, exhausted by scarcity, demanded change. Elites, frightened of chaos, whispered of order. The air grew tense, heavy with suspicion. In 1973, the military struck. Tanks rolled. Congress was dissolved. The democratic institutions that had survived decades of hardship were shut down in a single sweep. The generals declared themselves guardians of stability, but stability quickly turned into fear. Uruguay became a dictatorship. Censorship gripped newspapers and radio stations. Political parties were banned. Dissent was crushed. Neighbors watched each other with unease, wondering who might be an informant. Words became dangerous. Silence became survival. Prisons overflowed with political detainees. Torture became routine. Men and women vanished into the system, emerging broken, or not at all. The phrase, los desaparecidos, the disappeared, entered Uruguay's vocabulary, joining the tragic lexicon of Latin America's dictatorships. Families searched for loved ones who would never return. Mothers carried photographs through the streets, begging for answers, receiving none. Among those imprisoned was a man who would one day become president, José Pepe Mujica, a leader of the left-wing guerrilla group Tupamaros. Mujica had fought against the state with robberies, kidnappings, and propaganda campaigns. For that, he was hunted down, captured, and thrown into solitary confinement. 13 years he spent in prison. Years of hunger, torture, and silence. Years that nearly drove him mad. The Tupamaros had risen in the 1960s as a response to inequality and repression. Inspired by revolutionary movements across Latin America, they sought to shake the system. They carried out daring raids, stealing from banks and redistributing goods to the poor. They were part Robin Hood, part guerrilla army. But against the military regime, they were crushed. Their leaders imprisoned. Their fighters scattered. Their dream smothered in blood. For ordinary Uruguayans, daily life became a winter of fear. Soldiers patrolled streets. Curfews silenced nightlife. Libraries removed banned books. Even songs were censored, their lyrics deemed dangerous. The rhythm of tango and candombe was muted, stripped of political undertones. A culture once vibrant shrank under watchful eyes. The dictatorship lasted 12 long years. From 1973 to 1985, Uruguay was a prison disguised as a nation. Exiles fled abroad, carrying with them memories of loss and despair. Inside, people endured quietly, whispering resistance, waiting for the day the frost would break. Yet even in this darkness, seeds of resilience endured. Families taught children secretly about democracy. Underground groups circulated pamphlets. Musicians encoded lyrics, preserved memory. The spirit of Uruguay, wounded but not extinguished, smoldered beneath the surface. By the early 1980s, cracks appeared. The economy, once promised to flourish under military order, collapsed further. Foreign debt strangled the state. Public anger grew. International pressure mounted. The generals, once confident, now faced a people unwilling to remain silent. In 1984, a wave of protests surged through the country. Workers, students, families, thousands filled the streets demanding freedom. The military, weakened, could no longer hold them back. Negotiations began, and in 1985, democracy returned. The dictatorship ended, leaving behind scars that would not easily heal. Prisons stood as monuments of pain. Families still searched for the disappeared. Survivors carried memories of cells, interrogations, and shadows that would never fade. Uruguay emerged from the darkness, fragile but alive. Its democracy, once interrupted, was restored. Its people, once silenced, found their voices again. The years of dictatorship are remembered as a long winter, a season of cold repression, where warmth was smothered, where joy was muted, where trust was broken. But winters do not last forever, and Uruguay, scarred and smaller than ever, stepped once more into the light. The dictatorship collapsed in 1985. The generals, worn down by debt, protests, and isolation, handed power back to civilians. After 12 years of silence, Uruguayans could finally breathe again. But democracy's return was not triumphant. It was fragile. The streets filled with celebration, yes. Flags waved, families embraced, people sang in plazas. Yet beneath the joy lay wounds, deep, invisible, unhealed. Thousands carried scars of prison and torture. Mothers still searched for sons who had vanished. Exiles returned from Argentina, Spain, and beyond, only to find their homeland altered, their friends gone, their memories sharpened by absence. Uruguay was free again, but broken. The new civilian government faced a paradox. It had to restore trust in democracy while confronting the crimes of dictatorship. But how do you judge generals who still wield influence? How do you demand justice when the nation craves stability? The answer for Uruguay was compromise. An amnesty law was passed, shielding military officers from prosecution for human rights abuses. Many cried betrayal. Victims demanded accountability. But leaders argued that democracy itself might not survive without appeasing the armed forces. It was a bitter choice. Justice delayed in exchange for fragile peace. Even so, democracy slowly rebuilt itself. Political parties, long banned, returned to life. Elections were held. Newspapers printed freely. Radio stations spoke without fear. Parliament reopened, filling with debate and argument rather than silence. The machinery of freedom, rusty from disuse, began to turn again. Economically, the challenge was immense. The dictatorship had left debt and stagnation. Inflation gnawed its salaries. Poverty had spread. Rebuilding meant not only repairing institutions, but also restoring livelihoods. Ordinary people felt the struggle most. Workers returned to factories, but wages were low. Farmers fought to recover lost herds. Families patched homes neglected during years of repression. Uruguayans who had once been praised for their welfare state now lived with shortages and sacrifice. And yet, there was resilience. Schools reopened with renewed energy. Children once again studied without censorship. Universities buzzed with debate, students eager to reclaim their voices. Cultural life, long muted, bloomed again. Writers published stories silenced under dictatorship. Musicians composed songs of mourning and hope. Pain was transformed into art, into testimony, into memory. Civil society flourished. Human rights groups demanded truth. Families of the disappeared refused to be silent. Marches filled the streets every May, honoring those who never returned. Democracy in Uruguay was not just a system of voting, it was a movement of remembrance. The political landscape also shifted. The traditional rivalry of Colorados and Blancos remained. But a third force grew stronger, the Broad Front, a coalition of left-wing parties, labor unions, and social movements. It was born in opposition to dictatorship and carried the voices of those who demanded a different future. Step by step, Uruguay stabilized. Its democracy did not collapse into revenge. Its institutions held. Its society, though divided, remained committed to freedom. This was Uruguay's quiet triumph, not in sudden victory, but in patient endurance. The memory of the long winter haunted the new republic. It served as both warning and lesson. Uruguayans understood now how easily freedom could be lost. how quickly silence could return, how fragile democracy could be. And so, they cherished it with a determination that outsiders often underestimated. By the 1990s, Uruguay was once again respected abroad. It was small, yes, its economy modest. But its stability, its human rights movement, its culture of remembrance stood out in a region scarred by coups and crises. The work of rebuilding was not finished. It never would be. The disappeared remained disappeared. Justice was slow, often absent. Poverty lingered. Inequality persisted. But Uruguay had survived the test. Imagine the image. A nation of 3 million, standing between giants, scarred by dictatorship, yet lifting its head again. A small country that refused to vanish. A people who chose democracy, even when it was flawed, fragile, and incomplete. The return of democracy was not an ending. It was a beginning. A second chance to define themselves, to honor their past, to prepare for the future. And in that second chance, Uruguay would find something remarkable. Out of trauma, it would craft resilience. Out of exile, it would bring home leaders. Out of silence, it would rediscover its voice. This was not just a transition of power. It was the rebirth of a nation. Uruguay entered the 21st century with a reputation unlike any other in Latin America. It was small, yes. Poor in natural resources, yes. But it carried something rare: stability, resilience, and a willingness to be different. No figure embodied this spirit more than José Pepe Mujica. When Mujica became president in 2010, the world's cameras turned to Uruguay. Here was a man who had once been a guerrilla fighter, a prisoner in solitary confinement for 13 years, now leading his country as a democratically elected president. His life was a metaphor for Uruguay itself, scarred, humble, yet unbroken. Mujica refused to live in the presidential palace. Instead, he stayed in his modest farmhouse on the outskirts of Montevideo. He drove an old Volkswagen Beetle. He donated most of his salary to social programs. Reporters called him the world's poorest president. But he replied with a smile, "Poor is the one who needs too much." To Uruguayans, Mujica was more than a leader. He was a reminder that politics could be human, that power did not have to corrupt. To the world, he became a symbol of authenticity in an age of cynicism. But Mujica was not the only sign of Uruguay's difference. The country moved boldly into social reforms that shocked its neighbors. In 2012, Uruguay became the first nation in Latin America to legalize same-sex marriage. In 2013, it became the first in the world to fully legalize and regulate cannabis. Abortion was legalized under safe, regulated conditions. Each step placed Uruguay at the forefront of progressive politics, not just in the region, but globally. These were not easy decisions. Opposition was fierce. Critics warned of moral collapse. Religious groups protested. But the laws passed, reflecting Uruguay's deep tradition of secularism and social democracy. For Uruguayans, freedom was not only political, it was personal. And always, football. Uruguay's identity was tied to the game in ways no law could rival. The memory of 1930, when Montevideo hosted the first ever World Cup and Uruguay lifted the trophy, still burned bright. The miracle of Maracanã in 1950, when tiny Uruguay stunned Brazil before 200,000 fans in Rio, became legend. For a nation of barely 3 million, these victories were more than sport. They were proof that the small could conquer the mighty. Every World Cup rekindled that fire. Streets filled with blue jerseys, radios blared commentary. Children dreamed of wearing the celestial shirt of La Celeste. In football, as in history, Uruguay punched above its weight. Yet Uruguay's modern story was not only about reform or football. it was also about identity. Unlike its neighbors, Uruguay embraced modesty. No empire, no vast population, no endless wealth. Instead, it chose dignity, equality, and quiet strength. Its welfare state, though strained, continued to function. Education remained free, healthcare accessible, civil liberties strong. Corruption, though present, was far less corrosive than in much of the region. Transparency and trust became part of the national fabric. Foreign observers often looked with disbelief. How could such a small country achieve what larger nations could not? How could Uruguay, with so few resources, build a society so stable? The answer lay not in wealth, but in choices. Uruguay chose dialogue over violence, reform over repression, democracy over dictatorship. Of course, challenges persisted. Economic growth was uneven. Youth unemployment remained high. Emigration drained talent. Dependence on beef and soy exports left Uruguay vulnerable to global markets. And yet, compared to the turmoil of its neighbors, Uruguay remained an island of calm. The contrast was striking. While Argentina wrestled with financial crises, Uruguay balanced its books. While Brazil faced corruption scandals, Uruguay quietly maintained trust in institutions. While others burned with polarization, Uruguay's politics leaned toward consensus. This did not mean Uruguay was perfect. Far from it. Poverty still existed. Inequality was real. Rural communities felt left behind. But the scale was different. The extremes were softened. The system bent, but did not break. Mujica's presidency ended in 2015, but his spirit lingered. Uruguayans still remembered his humility, his flower garden, his simple words about life. He became part of the national myth, a symbol of the country's difference. In a world driven by spectacle, Uruguay offered something else: quiet resilience. Its difference was not in wealth, not in power, not in size. Its difference was in values. And so, Uruguay in the modern era stood apart. A small nation, yet a leader. A humble republic, yet a pioneer. A country that taught the world that dignity could be built not on monuments or armies, but on justice, equality, and memory. Today, Uruguay remains one of the smallest countries in South America. Just over 3 million people. A land squeezed between two giants, Brazil and Argentina. No mountains of gold, no seas of oil, no vast armies. On the map, it looks almost invisible. And yet, in the 21st century, the world looks to Uruguay with respect. Its Human Development Index is the highest in Latin America. Its democracy ranks among the most stable. Its institutions, though imperfect, are trusted more than most in the region. For many, Uruguay is not just a country, it is an example. Walk through Montevideo today, and you will see the story in its streets. Markets alive with color, elderly couples drinking mate on park benches, students debating politics in cafes, murals of football heroes beside memorials to the disappeared. The past and present sit side by side, never far apart. The welfare model, born more than a century ago, still survives. Education remains free. Healthcare remains accessible. Social security, though strained, continues. In a world where inequality grows sharper, Uruguay tries, however imperfectly, to soften the edges. Its progressive laws continue to draw attention. Same-sex couples marry openly. Cannabis is sold legally under state regulation. Women have access to safe reproductive care. These are not small achievements. They are signals of a society that dares to move ahead, even when larger nations hesitate. And still, football. Every international tournament reminds Uruguayans who they are. A small country, yes, but one that carries the heart of a giant. When La Celeste takes the field, the entire nation unites. Flags fly from balconies, radios echo through neighborhoods. For 90 minutes, Uruguay becomes larger than life. Yet life here is not without shadows. The economy remains vulnerable, tied to global markets for beef, wool, and soy. Rural poverty lingers. Young Uruguayans often leave, searching for opportunities abroad. The population grows slowly, aging year by year. These are the challenges of a small nation in a globalized world. But resilience defines Uruguay. It has endured colonization, civil wars, dictatorships, and crises. Each time it has bent, but not broken. Each time it has risen again, scarred but determined. There is a quiet dignity in this. Uruguay does not shout. It does not demand the spotlight. It builds patiently, persistently, with the tools it has. And in doing so, it teaches a lesson larger nations often forget. Greatness is not measured by size, but by values. Imagine a country of 3 million standing as a beacon of democracy. Imagine a republic, poor in resources, rich in justice. Imagine a people scarred by history, yet still believing in the future. That is Uruguay today. It is small, but it matters. It is fragile, but it endures. It is overlooked, but it inspires. In a world dominated by empires and superpowers, Uruguay whispers a different story. That sometimes the greatest lessons come not from the mighty, but from the modest. That sometimes the smallest voices carry the deepest truths. And so, as the 21st century unfolds, Uruguay stands, not as a forgotten corner, not as a battlefield pawn, not as a shadow between giants, but as a nation that chose dignity over despair, equality over indifference, and democracy over silence. A country small in numbers, a country vast in meaning.